There are performances that no one plans for, not the ones in the program, not the ones that are advertised on the marquee or reviewed in the morning papers. The performances that happen after the performance in the corridors, in the parking lots, in the small spaces between the end of a show and the beginning of the ordinary world that is always waiting outside the stage door. The performances that have no audience except one, and no script except the specific human moment that is happening right now, and no purpose except the purpose of being present for the one person who needs it. Robin Williams gave these performances many times across the course of his life. He gave them without cameras and without credit, and without any of the machinery that converted public acts into public narratives. He gave them because the moment required them, and he was a person who could not notice a moment requiring something and then not give it. This is the story of one of those performances. It happened in San Francisco in the autumn of 1993 at a small comedy club called the Purple Onion, on a night when Robin Williams was running late to his own set because the Mrs. Doubtfire production had gone over schedule, and his driver had hit the kind of traffic that San Francisco produces at the specific hour when the Bay Bridge and the evening and the fog all converge. He arrived at the Purple Onion with 23 minutes before he was supposed to take the stage. Not enough time for the full pre-show routine. Just enough time to check in with the club manager, get a sense of the room, and sit in the dressing room for a few minutes gathering the specific energy that a live set requires. The dressing room door was not fully closed, and through the gap, Robin Williams heard a conversation that he was not supposed to hear, between two men sitting in the corridor just outside, who did not know the dressing room was occupied. He heard a man's voice say, "I made her a promise," and that was where the evening changed. The Purple Onion was a San Francisco institution. It had opened in the 1950s and had been the launching ground for a generation of comedians who went on to become names the world recognized, and it had remained, through all of that, a neighborhood venue in a specific way, the kind of place where the comedy was live, and the drinks were real, and the laughter was the laughter of people who had come because they needed it, not because it was on a list of things to do. On the night in question, the club held 81 people. The tickets had sold out in 2 days when Robin Williams' appearance was announced. The specific demographic of a Robin Williams show at the Purple Onion in 1993 was the specific demographic of San Francisco in 1993. Mixed, young and not so young. The city in its working clothes rather than its dressed-up ones. Among those 81 people was a man named Walter Hendricks. Walter Hendricks was 56 years old. He had worked for 30 years as a civil engineer for the city of San Francisco. He had been married to his wife Margaret for 29 of those years. Margaret had died of cancer 4 months before the evening at the Purple Onion. She had been 54 years old. Walter and Margaret Hendricks had been, by the accounts of everyone who knew them, that specific and rare thing, genuinely happy together. Not in the performative way that some couples project happiness outward as a form of social management, but in the private way, the specific ease and warmth that comes from two people who have chosen each other for a long time and who have, over that time, built a life that is genuinely shared rather than merely cohabited. Margaret had been the funnier one. Walter would tell anyone who asked that this was simply true, that Margaret had a specific quality of humor that was warm and precise and entirely her own, and that one of the great pleasures of his life had been being made to laugh by his wife in the specific way that only the person who knows you best can make you laugh. She had also, in the last months of her illness, made Walter a promise. The promise was this, that when she was gone, Walter was to go out and laugh. Not immediately, she was not prescribing a timeline or a recovery schedule, but at some point, when he was ready, she wanted him to go somewhere where people were laughing and to laugh, and to let the laughter be what laughter is, not a betrayal of grief, and not a performance of recovery, but simply the thing it had always been between them. She had said, "You have to go and laugh, Walter. That is what I want for you." He had said, "I'll go. I promise." 4 months after Margaret's death, Walter Hendricks was sitting in the 80-person comedy club called The Purple Onion in San Francisco because Robin Williams was performing there, and because Margaret had loved Robin Williams's films, and because this was the closest Walter could get, 4 months out from the worst thing that had ever happened to him, to the thing she had asked him to do. He was sitting in the corridor outside the main room when Robin Williams arrived, because the main room was warm and close, and Walter had needed a few minutes of air before the show began. He was sitting with a friend, a man named Gerald Park, who had been Walter's colleague for 20 years and who had come to the show because Walter had called and said he needed company, and Gerald Park was the kind of friend who said yes when that call came. They were talking in the corridor in the low voices of people who are in a public space and are saying things that are private. Gerald had asked how Walter was doing. Walter had said the honest thing, which was that he was doing it, that he was here, that he had kept the promise, that it was hard to be in a room full of people who were about to laugh and to not know if he was going to be able to laugh with them or if the laughing was going to be one of those moments when grief converts even the good things into evidence of loss. And then he had said, "I made her a promise." He did not know that the dressing room door was open. He did not know that someone was on the other side of it. He was simply saying the true thing to his friend in the corridor, in the specific way that people say true things when they think no one else is listening. Robin Williams heard it. He sat in the dressing room for a moment after hearing it. He did not go immediately. He sat with what he had heard and let it arrive completely before he decided what to do with it. Then he did something that the club manager, a woman named Sandra Beal, who had been running the Purple Onion for 11 years and who had dealt with many performers in many states of pre-show preparation, later described as unlike anything she had seen in 11 years of running a comedy club. He opened the dressing room door and walked into the corridor and introduced himself to Walter Hendricks. Sandra Beal was at the end of the corridor when this happened. She saw it from a distance. She did not approach. She understood, with the specific instinct of a person who has spent 11 years reading rooms, that what was happening in the corridor was something that did not require her presence or her management. She stood at the end of the corridor and she watched. Robin Williams introduced himself and said, simply, "I heard what you said. I'm sorry about your wife." Walter Hendricks, by his subsequent account, had the specific response of a person who has been unexpectedly seen in their private moment, the brief recalibration, the assessment of whether to manage the moment or allow it, the decision, made in a fraction of a second, to allow it. He said, "Thank you." Robin Williams said, "Do you mind if I sit with you for a minute?" Walter looked at Gerald Park. Gerald Park looked at Walter. Walter said, "Please," and Robin Williams sat down in the corridor of the Purple Onion in San Francisco, 20 minutes before his show, and asked Walter Hendricks about Margaret. He asked specific questions, not the general questions of someone performing sympathy, what happened, how long, I'm so sorry, but the specific questions of someone who is genuinely curious about a specific person. What was she like? What was the funniest thing she ever did? What did she love that you could never quite understand? What is the thing you miss that you didn't know you would miss? Walter answered. He talked about Margaret in the way that people talk about someone they have loved for a long time and recently lost, the way that oscillates between past and present tense without quite settling. The way that is full of specific details, because the specific details are the thing, the way that sounds like love when you hear it spoken out loud. He talked about her laugh first. The specific quality of Margaret's laugh, which was, he said, the thing he heard most clearly when he thought about her. Not her voice speaking, but her voice laughing, the particular sound of it. He talked about the evening she had burned an entire pot of soup because she had been reading a book and forgotten it was on the stove, and how she had laughed at herself about it, with the specific warmth of someone who found her own failings genuinely funny, and how they had eaten toast for dinner that night, and it had been one of the best dinners of his life. He talked about the promise. Robin Williams listened to all of it. He asked follow-up questions. He did not redirect the conversation toward himself, did not offer his own experiences of loss as comparison or counterweight, did not perform the grief of a person who has heard something sad. He simply received what Walter was giving him and stayed with it. At some point during the conversation, Walter Hendricks laughed. It was not a large laugh. It was not the releasing, cathartic laugh that stories of this kind often culminate in. The laugh that sweeps away the grief and announces the beginning of something. It was a small laugh, the specific laugh that comes from remembering something funny about someone you loved. The laugh that is also the cry beneath it. The laugh that contains the person it is about, in the most complete way that laughter can contain a person. Robin Williams heard it. He did not celebrate it. He did not call attention to it. He received it the way he received everything in those 20 minutes, as what it was, nothing more and nothing less. Sandra Beal, watching from the end of the corridor, later said, "I don't know what they said. I was too far away to hear. I only know that about 15 minutes in, the man who had been talking in the low, careful voice of someone carrying something very heavy started talking in a different voice, and then I heard him laugh. It was a small laugh, and Robin Williams just sat there with it for a moment, like it was the most important thing that had happened all evening, which I suppose it was. The show started 7 minutes late. Sandra Beal told the audience that Robin was running a few minutes behind and would be right out. The audience received this with the good humor of a comedy club audience that has been served drinks and is in the specific mood of people who have paid to have a good time and are already having it. Robin Williams took the stage at 8:37. He was on stage for 1 hour and 22 minutes. Sandra Beal has described that set as the best she saw in 11 years of running The Purple Onion, and she had seen a great many sets in 11 years of running The Purple Onion. She uses the specific language of someone who has watched a lot of live performance and knows the difference between a performance that is working and a performance that is alive. She says, "It was alive. Every minute of it. There was nothing managed about it. He was in the room the way performers are in the room, when something has happened before they went out that made the performance matter more than performances usually matter." Walter Hendricks sat in the third row on the left side. He had been to many comedy shows in his life. He had laughed at many performers. This was different from all of them. He laughed. He laughed in the specific way Margaret had asked him to laugh, not as a performance of recovery, not as a demonstration of moving on, but as the thing itself, the simple, genuine, unmanaged response of a person in a room where something funny is happening. He laughed without thinking about whether he should be laughing, or whether the laughing meant something about his grief, or whether Margaret would have wanted him to laugh exactly this much or a different amount. He simply laughed. Gerald Park, sitting beside him, later said, "I had been worried about him. I had been worried about whether he could get through the evening without it becoming something too large to carry. And then, about 40 minutes in, I looked over, and he was just laughing. Not crying and laughing, not the complicated kind, just laughing. And I thought, okay, he's okay." She knew what she was asking him to do. After the show, after the audience had filed out, and the club had gone to its post-show state of cleared tables and stacked chairs, and the specific acoustic quality of a room that has just been full of people, Robin Williams came back out. He had changed out of the performance clothes. He was in the plain, dark jacket he'd been wearing when he arrived. He walked through the emptied main room to where Walter Hendricks and Gerald Park were still sitting. They had stayed after the show without quite knowing why. The specific staying after of people who are not yet ready to leave a room that has given them something. Robin Williams sat down at their table. He did not ask how the show was. He did not perform the post-performance graciousness of a comedian checking in with an audience member. He sat down and looked at Walter and said, "She would have laughed at the bit about the cable car." Walter Hendricks looked at him. He said, "How did you know she was from San Francisco?" Robin Williams said, "You told me. In the corridor. You said she loved this city. The cable car bit is about this city." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She would have laughed at it. You're right. She would have laughed at exactly that part." They sat at the table for a while. Gerald Park was there. Sandra Beal hovered at a respectful distance. managing the post-show close-down with the specific efficiency of someone who is also making sure that a particular table is not interrupted. They did not talk about grief specifically. They talked about San Francisco, the city, the specific things about it that are funny if you have lived there long enough to know where the funny is. Robin Williams talked about the Mrs. Doubtfire production, which was shooting in the city, and about the specific comedy of a man in a fat suit navigating San Francisco hills. And Walter laughed again, a larger laugh this time, the laugh that the first small laugh in the corridor had made possible. When Robin Williams stood to leave for the second time that evening, he shook Walter's hand. He said, "She sounds like someone I would have liked to know." Walter said, "She was." Robin Williams nodded. He left. Walter Hendricks sat at the table for a while longer. Gerald Park sat with him. Sandra Beal brought them coffee, without being asked. The club was empty now, the chairs up on the tables around them, the lights at their lowest working level. Walter said, eventually, "I kept the promise." Gerald said, "You did." Walter said, "She would have liked him." Gerald said, "I think she would have liked what he did in the corridor more than the show." Walter thought about this. Then he said, "I think you're right." He went home that night and sat in the apartment he had lived in with Margaret for 22 years and thought about the evening. He thought about the corridor and the 20 minutes and the questions Robin Williams had asked, the specific questions, the ones about the particular person, not the general questions about loss. He thought about Margaret's laugh. He thought about the cable car bit. He thought about what Gerald had said. She would have liked what he did in the corridor more than the show. He thought, she would have. She always liked the thing after the thing more than the thing itself. She always said the real conversation was the one that happened once everyone stopped trying to have a real conversation. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the small, specific smile of a person who has just understood something about someone they loved. Understood it from the outside, for the first time, from a vantage point that the loss itself had given him. A clarity that he could not have had if she were still here to be complicated and present and alive. He sat with it. He kept the promise. He went to bed. And somewhere in the city, Robin Williams drove back to the set hotel and the next morning's call sheet and the ordinary machinery of a large film production, carrying nothing from the evening except what everyone carries from evenings that required something real of them. The specific quiet of having been somewhere and given something and come back. He did not mention the corridor to anyone. He did not need to. The performance was not the show. The performance was the 20 minutes before it, in the corridor, sitting with a man who had made a promise to his wife. That was the real show. That was the one that mattered. That was the one that would never be reviewed in the morning papers, or mentioned in a career retrospective, or described in the authorized biography of a comedian who performed for hundreds of millions of people across 6 decades of a public life. But it was the one that Walter Hendricks carried with him for the rest of his life. And it was the one that Sandra Beal thought about when she was asked, years later, what was the most memorable night in 11 years of running the Purple Onion. She did not say the show. She said, "There was a night when Robin Williams arrived late and sat in the corridor with a man for 20 minutes before he went on. I don't know what they said. I only know that the man was laughing by the end of it. And then Robin went out and did the best set I ever saw in this room." She paused, and then she said, "I think the set was the best because of the corridor. I think something happened in that corridor that made the set matter differently. Like he was performing for that one man, even in front of 80 people. Like the whole show was really just the continuation of what had started in the hallway. The empty seat. Margaret Hendricks did not have a seat at the Purple Onion on the night in question. Her husband sat in the 3rd row on the left side, in the seat that was his, and the seat beside him was Gerald Park's, and the seat that would have been Margaret's was wherever she was, which was the city she had loved. The city that had a cable car bit that she would have laughed at. The city where she had lived and been funny and made her husband laugh for 29 years and had left him with a promise that he kept. He kept it. He went and he laughed. And before the laughing started, a man sat with him in a corridor and asked about her, and heard about her laugh, and heard about the soup, and heard about the promise, and sat with all of it until the small laugh came. That was enough. That was everything.